me today is Shane Brennan, who is Chief Executive of the Cold Chain Federation. And Shane, you are really basically the representative of the entire chilled, refrigerated food that comes into Britain. And you represent 200 businesses, 500 facilities, and 30,000 the fleet of vehicles, basically. That's quite a job. So suddenly supply chains are the new buzzword. It's like herd immunity or Brexit. And I don't think all of us really know what we mean. So I would love you to explain very briefly, first of all, how it works, and then we can talk about all the disruption. So over to you.
Okay, so all the food that we eat arrives to us on our plates via some kind of linked group of commercial businesses that have gone from the production of that good or the import of that good through a warehousing operation, probably a primary operation of warehousing, through to a retail distribution center or a hospitality distribution center, and then from there onto a supermarket shelf or into a restaurant, and then from there into somebody's home. Of course, there are online delivery operations. There are all kinds of different variations within that. But in simple terms, it's moving from A to B to C to D to E with different companies handing goods off between each other in order for it to arrive to the people that need it.
Right, perfect. So first of all, I think you said earlier when we were chatting that about 40% of our food comes from overseas. But the problems that we've had recently in this supply chain are not just because of overseas. Could you, from your point of view, explain to us what has happened? Because one of the striking moments of the pandemic was how brilliantly our supply chains worked. You know, supermarkets didn't run out, everybody had everything, everybody worked overtime. It was superb. So is this sort of the after effect? Just talk us through what has been happening.
So yeah, absolutely. Well, I totally agree that what we've shown, the number one story of pandemic Britain is the resilience of our supply chains. I guess what I would say is that now, as the rest of the country starts to think about the world after the pandemic, the supply chains are still in the middle of it. And if anything, the situation they're in right now is the worst part. And the fundamental problem is a problem of people, not having enough people to do the job. And actually at different phases of the pandemic, we didn't have a people problem. We had a problem of businesses not necessarily being open. We had a problem of businesses being shut down for a period, particularly those servicing the hospitality sector. The whole of the food service industry was shut, and their supply chains therefore shut as well. And therefore we had a lot of people, because a lot of people were working in supply chains didn't have a job at that time. As we've opened back up again, as both supply chains, the grocery supply chain and the hospitality supply chains are firing back up and demand starting to peak and lots of unpredictability in that, we don't have enough people to do the job. And that means, and we're probably about 15-20% less people than we need. And that is creating huge pressure on those people. So the ones that have worked throughout have been working in crisis mode for 2 years now, pretty much, and they are tired. And yet they're asking us to do even more and push another step further without the people around the reinforcements they need. So that's really the sort of the core of the supply chain disruption. It's really that people to drive the trucks, people to work the warehouses, people to do the planning in the back office, to actually move the goods around. And actually, it's not really an import problem. It's not really about the goods coming into the country. It's about the fact that we can't handle the goods once they're here, or they're coming out off the fields, or they're coming out of production facilities in the UK to get them to where they need to be. So it's a real kind of dislocation in our supply chain.
In a sense, what we've seen is we kept steady through the pandemic as we've then sort of jumped out at various stages of the lockdown. Demand has soared. But at the same time, the supply of workers has contracted. Now, what I think puzzles a lot of people is that, the HGV driver problem is not new. This has been going on for over a decade, and there are various reasons. It's not a great job. There haven't been great conditions. It's a young man's job. I think the average age is 53. Why would you want to drive a truck at 60? So we've had all, but what I want to say, and I'm not defending the Prime Minister, I'll come on to that in a minute, is that the industry has known about that. That was a pre-Brexit problem. Brexit obviously compounded it, and we had 20,000 people leave. But we're short of 100,000 supposedly, so we can't blame that shortage. So can we say that businesses have not been planning not looking forward well enough? Had they hoped it would just improve naturally through the market, and then the pandemic struck? Do you see what I'm saying? We can't.
Yeah.
20,000.
Yeah, no,
We've
totally,
known that for
totally.
3 years, 4 years.
And you can't underestimate. I don't underestimate the amount of soul searching that's going on across the supply chain at the moment. But why? Well, how have we got to this? Why are we in this situation? And also, what does tomorrow look like? And no one has. And the biggest problem, probably of all, is that no one can say with certainty when this particular window of problems is coming to an end. It's certainly not going to be in the next few weeks. It's probably not going to be for the next few months. It may not even be until the end, into 2022 and 2023 and beyond. So it's definitely a lot of. No one is saying that government is wholly to blame for this problem, but we have an unprecedented set of circumstances, particularly around the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, but also because we have the post-pandemic problems or realities, and then we have the fact that the government has massively changed the rules of the game when it comes to the employment market. We cannot underestimate how inflexible we have suddenly made our labour market. And we talk about the need to bring in people into employment in the UK. We have a 4.6% employment rate. The government's been paying the general population to stay at home in jobs, well, in government-funded wages for the whole of the last 9-10 months, and yet. And there isn't just a lot of people around. So first of all, you have to employ better, you have to pay more, and you have to bring in more British workers. But it's not really clear that they're actually available. It's not actually clear there is enough. Even if we were paying whatever we were paying, there's not necessarily clear there's enough people in the workforce. Now, of course, the question you asked me, of course, was about resilience. Yeah. And yes, absolutely, truck drivers have been getting older and older, and the next generation of truck drivers have not been coming through. And that has been a systematic and fundamental problem in the market. Now, which businesses weren't planning for this? Haulage businesses absolutely were planning for this. Haulage businesses were absolutely talking about the problems they were facing with that. They were looking at ways in which they could try and manage that situation, looking at what strategies they could put in place to cope with this structural decline in their industries.
Was that even pre-pandemic? Was that even pre-pandemic? They were worried.
Pre-pandemic, absolutely. I mean, I don't think anyone who runs a haulage operation didn't have a very acute awareness of the problem of lack of drivers coming immediately in their business and coming down the track. The problem is that in the supply chain, the bit in the middle, us, the logistics companies, we don't have any market power. The whole reality of consumer economy that we've lived in, the supermarket revolution, if you will, is that you get what you want. You ask for it, we'll make it happen. You want to massively increase the amount of pumpkins you're selling this week. That will happen. We'll make that happen because we're really good at doing that.
You can get anything anywhere, really.
Any way you want. And the only real consideration that is assumed, that delivery is assumed by the customer base. And the only thing you care about is how cheap it is. Yeah. So every year the conversation is how do you deliver that by taking out more cost? How do you do it? And if you don't, we'll go to somebody else. And I have a market that is basically entirely about price, and with no concept of resilience, no concept of future planning within that supply chain. Because it's always happened before, it will happen in the future. What coronavirus has done is said actually resilient supply chains is probably the theme of the next 20 years of our economy. And we're going to start seeing a lot more investment in supply chains. To be fair, we need to do that anyway because of the net zero challenge, which is a sort of secondary point. But that does mean that the cost of supply chains has to go up. And only now the customers are severely stressed can we start talking about how we actually inflate the cost and the real value of logistics operations. So I guess that's another blame shift. But when government says it's business's problem, they talk as though business is one thing. It's not. It's a whole load of millions of different commercial actors with different commercial interests. And it's very easy for government to start saying, well, it's not our problem, it's business. Well, government is responsible for strategy. Government is responsible for coordination. Government is responsible for setting the priorities and the parameters. And they haven't cared about the weaknesses in our infrastructure for way too long. And now we've been presented with that problem. They're saying it's not their fault. Well, that's very convenient politically. It's just not, it doesn't really help us economically. It doesn't help us with solving the problems.
It's a cheap shot in a sense, because it is a dialogue between the two. But let's go back. So pre-pandemic, everybody knew that the visas would go, that workers would go back to Europe. So are you saying that the hauliers and other parts of the industry have been saying we have this shortage, we need to allow in workers? But example. Supposedly we have no butchers and people to work in the abattoirs. Well, 50,000 butchers haven't just suddenly gone back to Europe. I mean, did we rely on EU work for this?
Maggie, to be fair, they did. To be fair, they did, and that's one of the things about it. So everyone knew that once the Brexit vote happened, and we had and the idea of controlling immigration was part of it, that there would be a structural shift in the availability of labour as a result of the Brexit change. But the pandemic meant that tens of thousands of people changed their lives to go and be safe, to go and live with their families. So a great exodus of people that were European nationals living in the UK who had settled status, they were told they were allowed to stay. They went home because of the pandemic. The problem is now that Brexit means that they're not necessarily going to come back. And that is a fundamentally unpredictable event that occurred that we would have had an erosion that probably would have accelerated, but it's not the same as what we actually experienced because of the pandemic. And I guess one of the things that's so frustrating is that there's no acknowledgement in government policy on this, that the pandemic is a unique circumstance.
Yeah.
And the coming out of the pandemic is a unique circumstance that requires a unique intervention. Instead, it's red lines. It's been red lines on Brexit, it's red lines on immigration, because that's what's politically convenient for the government. And if it's not working and there are consequences of that, well, it's because the businesses are to blame. Yeah. Okay, well, we're on our own then. So we have to basically just think about how we cope with this situation and accept that government is of no help to us. If anything, they are our opponents in trying to find solutions to these problems. And that means everyone goes to their corners. And it's not helpful, but that's the reality we're faced with, particularly this week.
Well, that is a ludicrous situation for a Conservative government that's supposedly pro-business, pro-free enterprise. So how do you think that can be solved? Because red corners don't deliver food onto the table and going into maybe a very cold winter. How do we come out? Are there organizations like CBI that I know you're separate, but can business, this amorphous mass, but the various parts, how can you get your view put across to them and argued so that some of these problems are solved?
So we keep making our point, and we'll carry on making the point. Obviously, the government was absolutely not going to have any kind of visa scheme whatsoever for foreign labour until the weekend of the 25th and 26th of September, when they suddenly announced one. So this is not a government that doesn't change its red lines at a moment's notice or on a whim. So we'll continue to make evidence-based case for change. But fundamentally, the point of I'm saying to my members and my member companies is you're on your own. So what are the strategies that you can employ to get through this period? Yeah. And that is fundamentally saying, right, we've got 80% of the capacity we did have of vehicles and warehouse capacity. We've got 80% of the supply chain capacity. We have to reorganize our expectations around 80% capacity. It doesn't mean we haven't got enough food. It doesn't mean that we can't have lots of choice on the shelf. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean we have to set different expectations across the board of what the next few months are going to look like. And let's be honest, Maggie, that is what the situation has been for the last few months. Customers have got used to the fact that the supplies on their shelves are not as readily available as they always have been. There are gaps. There are times when you go to the shop and there's something isn't there, but it is there again tomorrow. That kind of interruption model that's there will carry on now for a period of months. And we just have to plan on that basis and start taking the pressure off.
Are those gaps in the shelves the result of the supermarkets with the supply chain deciding to concentrate on fewer but more solid lines? Is that a conscious thing? It's not that I've heard all sorts of, the Italians are not making, pasta this year because they had a terrible whatever. But from what I can gather, that's not true. The supply is coming through, but because this 20% drop in capacity, they're having to make the choices of what they bring to. That's what you're saying.
Absolutely, making hard choices, right? Rather than, and let's be clear, a major supermarket has 20,000 lines of products on its shelves, whereas a discounter supermarket has 2,000. So there are different retailing models on different amounts of choice. And if you've only got a certain number of vehicles, but you fill them up with one type of product rather than 3 different or 4 different types or 20 different types of product, that can make your supply chain more efficient. The downside of that is that choice removed from the shelf, and choice often means the smaller businesses are the ones that suffer. If Tesco says, right, we can only have one type of beans, then Heinz beans will be on the shelf, and the small, I'm not sure if there are small niche beans makers, but that's the guy that won't get his products or won't get extra products on the shelf. And that is a fundamentally unfair situation to be in. It's a needs must, but it's fundamentally unfair.
And it serves the big chains, of course, as you say.
And it consolidates the big. And so big businesses apparently are the enemy. The big businesses are the ones that are addicted to cheap labour, says the Prime Minister in his headlines.
Yeah.
Well, what about small businesses? Small businesses are operating in the same labour market. And actually, it's the big businesses that can get their products on the shelf through their market power. It's the big businesses that can pay more because they can find a way to find more money for the labour that is available. It's the small business that actually gets completely squeezed in the middle of that. And that is completely ignored from the political rhetoric.
You said at the beginning, Shane, that over the last few decades, and I've written a lot about the retail industry myself, so I've seen this, and that is that there was a trade-off, if you like, between price and resilience. I mean, supermarkets, Tesco's, now they've got rivals, Lidl, Aldi. I mean, their profit margins are really, when people sort of say fat cat supermarkets, it's not true. They are very slim. Would you say that we, the consumer, also has to make a trade-off in that we must accept fewer choice, maybe fewer lines on the supermarket shelves, and maybe more expensive goods? I mean, have we had it too good for too long?
We've had everything we need. We've had everything in every way for too long, and that isn't the reality of a resilient supply chain. That we're now going to go into a phase where it's partly about the number of lines you've got on the shelf, but it's also about the number of routes you've got to get to market. You can go to the supermarket, you can go to the convenience store, you can order online, you can order, if you're in a city, you can order for delivery within 30 minutes. All of that kind of choice of access to product, which is created, and supermarkets and retailers have gone after that because it creates a grab on market share, but actually is ultimately not financially sustainable. It's a kind of survival of the fittest mentality. That is not the reality of the situation. We can't cope with that now. That's what we can't cope with in terms of resilience in our supply chain. So we have to simplify. For at least we have to simplify to retrench, and then potentially to rebuild from a new foundation. But that new foundation is probably going to be more expensive. It's probably not going to be as flexible, and it's going to be more about consumers thinking more about what they buy and how they buy it. And that fits with the whole. And as I said it earlier, it fits with the whole need to change consumer attitudes going into a net zero economy. You know, we need to be less wasteful.
In January, or asparagus. You don't fly it in from Kenya, the green beans and so forth.
And certainly don't buy more than you need.
Yeah.
You know, that is absolutely at the core of it. You know, buy what you need, plan ahead, think about ingredient shopping, all those different kinds of things. That is the and as supply chains become expensive, price points and choice points and access points into those things will become more restricted, and therefore that will sort of dictate some of that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing overall, but it's incredibly painful to get from where we are today to where we get to then. And basically government saying no transition, hard medicine approach, and the end result will be great because we believe it will be.
Well, on that note, what Boris Johnson, who said it again in his conference speech today, we want a high-skilled, high productivity, high-wage economy. Actually, I'm not sure he said the high productivity. What the government has been saying the last few months is, okay, you haven't got these drivers, go and pay them more. They haven't been paid enough. Wages have been depressed, compressed by cheaper labour. And indeed, a lot of the supermarkets have, and supposedly, you know, it's now salaries have gone up to 50,000. Do you think that the low wages were a problem in the industry, and did the import of so much labour compress wages? Well, I've seen some reports that pre-mass immigration from the EU, in fact, salaries were higher and they came down. And do you think that that is the answer, or is there? And can you get higher productivity than you already have?
Someone needs to define for me what low wages are.
Yeah.
Because HGV drivers do not earn minimum wage. You know, they earn significantly more than the minimum wage. And yes, and one of the things that's come through, and one of the things we have to do is listen to drivers more than we probably have. Again, back to that soul searching point. They are saying that they don't believe their job is valued enough, and pay is one of the points at which you demonstrate value to someone in terms of how you value them. It's not the only one. I don't believe, particularly when it comes to HGV drivers, this morning's news round by Dominic Raab, unskilled labour. Well, HGV driver is not unskilled.
No, absolutely.
Let's be absolutely clear about that. There is absolutely nothing unskilled about someone who drives a HGV. And I am not completely convinced that the 5-10% of the workforce that were non-UK based nationals driving in our domestic workforce were the reason why pay was where it was at. It's actually that kind of competitiveness in the market and the demands of the customer base that was driving that. Of course, this is a market-wide thing. The government's saying this is about every part of the economy. So it's also the warehouse workers and the cleaners and the technicians and the administrators in the back office. And if we're saying that everyone has to have higher wages compared to where they are now, well, we've got to define that. Let's start defining that and saying what that actually means. Is it 20% more? Is it 30% more? And if the wages at the bottom or a lower quartile of wages go up by that amount, what about the next quartile up or the next quartile up? That is a huge amount of inflation in the overall costs. And again, maybe inflation is what we need right now in our economy, but uncontrolled inflation, I think we all know where that's taken us in the past.
Yeah. No, it's dangerous. What I haven't heard much debate about during this period is the use of freight and rail to shift. The use of rail to shift freight. And I know that Tesco actually over the last few years have invested very heavily in direct trains that they use for their refrigerated goods from Valencia going right up to Edinburgh, I believe. Now, would that not only, number one, it's safer, environmentally, it's cleaner. Is there more that we could do in the country, or have we chopped off so many of the smaller depot lines and whatever that we don't have a good enough rail infrastructure to move a lot of these goods?
We can do more.
Yeah.
Because we can definitely do more because it's on a very, very low base right now.
What percentage? Do we know? Do you know what percentage?
I couldn't tell off the top of my head, but it's going to be like sub 10%, 5%, something like that. It's a very, very small percentage of our freight movements, particularly in food. You know, in food it's a very, very small percentage. It'd be sub 1%, I'd imagine. But so we can do more, particularly using our rail more efficiently, using the rail outside of the times when we need it for commuters. But it is a pretty limited infrastructure that we already have, and the amount of investment plan for it is not that high. So the reality is that the commuter will always win when it comes to the use of the rail. So I think that's one of the key challenges there. But modal shift is really important. Actually, one of the other things is thinking about how we use things like our waterways. You know, there's probably more we could do. Certainly servicing our cities, such as like London, are not using its waterways to any way the way it needs in terms of its infrastructure. So these are things around the edges, but I mean, again, that's government. If that's going to happen, there has to be government. That is not something business will do on its own, under its own steam. Whatever this sort of belief in what the free market can achieve has suddenly become, these things have to be coordinated. They can be funded out of the private sector, but they can't be delivered without proper strategic government planning. And that's what we're told the government doesn't want to do in this window of time, according to the Prime Minister today.
No, absolutely. So Shane, what are you a betting man? How do you think the winter is going to be? Do you think it's going to, have we got over the worst? Maybe the petrol issue was perhaps the sort of peak. Are we going to go into a winter of maybe some shortages, as you said, fewer lines, which, frankly, most of us can cope with. How do you think it's going to pan out?
I think we're going to have, what we have now is what we're going to have through Christmas. Okay. So it's going to be less range, less predictable, and there's going to be, and above all, Maggie, the people who are working in supply chains are going to have to work incredibly hard for another 3 or 4 months behind the scenes to try and keep things on an even keel. So that's my prediction, is that it will be okay, but it won't be what people are used to from the pre-pandemic days, and it will be okay as long as consumers bear with the realities of the supply chain we're dealing with. They understand that we're still in the post-pandemic phase. We're not back to normal, and that they do think responsibly about what they do in terms of their behavior in the supply chain, buying what they need, planning ahead, thinking about things, and trying not to put pressure on, trying to avoid putting pressure on the system, because empty shelves are caused by panic buying. That's what happened. I mean,
panic buying is a fascinating subject. It is entirely rational when you hear there's shortage that you go and stock up, is it not? You'd be foolish not to. Having said that, the panic buying creates the shortages. So your message is buy what you need, learn to live with a little bit less, and
Yeah, I mean, well, learn to live with the fact that it won't be there necessarily. If you go there on a Monday night, it's not there. It probably be confident it'll be there on Tuesday and Wednesday, and don't suddenly go and raid the toilet aisle because you're worried there's going to be shortages in the toilet aisle because there's someone on the other side. It's that kind of being rational and being almost stoic a bit about the situation.
Resilient.
We achieved that during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want it to sound like it's like austerity. It really isn't. There will be plenty of stuff on the shelves. It's just about making sure that people understand that these interruptions are there and there's a reason for them, but the supply chain is doing its best, and it is resilient. It's proved itself to be resilient every other phase, and it will be again. And just think about that person driving the warehouse, driving that truck for the additional hours, the person who's working extra shifts in the warehouse, and think about taking some of the pressure off them.
Yeah, but we have to be careful. These people don't, have accidents, as you said, driving highly skilled jobs so that they're not worn out.
Oh, absolutely. We are losing people from our industry because they're overworked.
Really? Oh, that's terrible. One final point, Shane. Obviously, a lot of people, probably fewer in your industry, but some were on furlough during this period. Do you think there are a lot of people, some of the reasons why you haven't got so many workers is a lot of people have just decided, maybe they saved money over furlough or found other jobs doing temporary, just decided it was too highly pressurized, so simply haven't come back into the market? Or is that?
I think there's definitely a situation. No one knows what the end of furlough effect is going to be, and I don't think we'll know until next year. But there will definitely be people whose outlays in the coronavirus pandemic lockdown period went down dramatically. They had enough money, and they're feeling like, well, we'll wait and see what we're going to do about going back into the workforce into next year. They're probably not the sort of people that do the sort of manual jobs that we are looking for in some of our core kind of shortage areas. Right. Nonetheless, I think there is that dynamic at play. But also there's an issue of, it's about dislocation. If you're a furloughed artist, it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to go and work in a warehouse. So these are some of the sort of the realities of the human side of some of these sort of talk of numbers. And it's about someone just choosing a career, choosing a lifestyle, and you just can't assume that someone who's out of work over there is going to be happy working in a logistics environment. Yeah,
no, it's not simple. And Shane, you're right at the apex of it all, critical part of our economy. Thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you very much.
The message to all of us is to be patient, to be resilient, make more bean stews, and but maybe stock up on candles. We haven't even talked about electricity shortages.
Responsibly stock up.
Any of you. Thank you so much, Shane. Talk again soon.
All right. Take care. Cheers.
Bye. Bye-bye.